There we go. And then we will get the slides up. I really mean it. There we go. All right. And I need to share my screen. That is the other step. Here we go. All right.
They're up.
Slides are up. Excellent. It says participants can now see my screen. I've got a lovely little row of people rather than the usual Brady Bunch, which is convenient for me. All right. So hello everybody. If you are joining us either for your second or third time, welcome back. Um, Thank you so much for sticking with us through two sessions so far. If this is the first time joining us for the orientation series, my name is Al Hayden. I'm the Library Advisory Specialist here at the MBLC. I am here with Rob Favini. He's the head of library advisory and development and our government liaison. And I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about what he does now because I am such an outrageous policy nerd that he just lets me take over and Rob gets to watch the chat on this one. So, Rob, if you want to say a few
Sure.
words before I get into the zone.
I know well enough just to step aside because you'll the policy will be flying. Hi everyone, thanks for coming and taking time out of your schedules. One thing I kept forgetting to do the other sessions was I wanted to thank all of you for being trustees and for volunteering. We've talked a lot about roles of trustees, but it really is a key functioning of libraries in Massachusetts, and we really appreciate. We know you got a lot going on. You don't have to do this, so we do appreciate it. As Al said, I'm the head of library advisory and development and government liaison. I get the privilege of heading up a team of specialists and consultants that provide services, as Al does, to library trustees, directors, and foundations and friends groups. We have another specialist who concentrates on underserved populations, and another one who does work with preservation and archives. So we are here to help with all kind of aspects of libraries in Massachusetts, and we appreciate you participating tonight. I'll turn it over to Al so we can get right into the policy.
All right, thank you. So, and Rob actually did a great job of describing what I do really well. So we will move to the next slide. So hopefully by now, now that we're past the halfway point here, you have a better idea of your place in the library ecosystem, the larger one in Massachusetts, and your own little individual library ecosystem. Your role as a board member and the roles that you may want to take on as you get more comfortable on the board. So now that you've got a better sense of the broad strokes, we are going to dive into what I consider one of your most important duties. And if it's done well, it will also be a regular duty. So let's get into library policy. So I am not going to hold the expectation over you that at the end of this hour you will become a giant policy nerd the way I am. But I am hoping that what we'll talk about today will encourage you to take a look at your policy binder and start some revisions, and at the very least, not relegate your policies to a dusty shelf for a couple of decades. I have been on the other end of taking that dusty product policy binder off of the shelf after a literal 2 decades of not having been looked at and adjusted. And it's a project. So let's not do that to you or your successors or your library administration. And let's figure out some ways to work through that piece by piece. So, what we're going to be talking about tonight is your role in policy, why we set policy in the first place. I'll go through a few policies that I really strongly advise are essential and that it's always best practice to have in your policy binder. I'll go through some best practices when it comes to thinking about what goes into your policies and also what does not go into your policies. We'll talk about reviewing and revising and getting things on a schedule. And as always, Rob and I will be here for questions for as long as you need us for. So this is the fun disclaimer part. I cannot read that as quickly as maybe one of those disclaimer people on TV would. But I am not a lawyer. Rob is not a lawyer. The MBLC is not designed to govern any libraries, so nothing of what we say here is intended to be or will constitute legal advice. What we're going to be talking about are best practices and recommendations to keep everybody in your library safe. Policies should never be enacted without some form of legal scrutiny, because if they're not legally defensible, then they are not protecting you, your staff, or your library, or your municipality. Um, so if at all possible, have your town council, a lawyer versed in this type of law who may be already on the board, or maybe somebody in town knows, or have somebody with some form of official legal advice look over your policies to ensure that they are defensible. So, library policy is the set of documents that govern the operations of the library board, the library itself. And this is why your role in as a board is so important, because you are the ones creating those policies, which sets the tone for all of those operations that you have entrusted to your library director. Um, so unless you're me, policy isn't really that fun, and it tends to get pushed aside for matters that are a little bit more urgent, like overrides, stressed budgets, or things that are just plain more exciting and interesting to talk about, like programming and collaborations. But it is absolutely essential to the success, life, staff, and safety of your library to have policies that are current, that are actionable, and that are above all legally defensible. So in our first session, we talked a little bit about who plays what role in the library overall. So let's take a little bit of a deeper role into what your role and the other role of the director and the staff are when it comes specifically to policy. So your role is the creation, or in most cases, revision of the governing documents, or if you're an advisory board, again, harkening back to that first session, recommending what those governing documents should contain. Um, you should be reviewing your policy binder piece by piece on a rotating basis to keep everything relevant. In some cases, it's the chair. In some cases, the board does it as a whole. You could also have a policy committee, and they can be the ones that keep track of what's next on the docket to review. Policy should never be stagnant. The library is a really nimble organization. Circumstances change, the library adapts with it, and policy should adapt as the library does. So policy review should make a regular appearance on your meeting agenda. In terms of who else is going to be interacting with your policy, much like your director is your boots on the ground and eyes and ears handling the daily operations. That's pretty much the same as what they do for policy as well. Your director is going to have the ability to understand the daily environment, the staff and patron interactions, what is and what isn't working well within the library. So to that end, it's a really good idea to listen to your director, because they're going to be able to advise you on how policy may need to be adapted to work well within the library. They may also know of something that's coming up, and they might want to make sure that a policy is honed and ready to protect everybody. So they may want to add a policy or put a policy up for review outside of its regular rotation. They're also going to be your strong arm when it comes to enacting your library policy. Under most circumstances, it's going to be your director who has the authority to carry out the directives written into the policy. And the language should reflect that. So a lot of policies will have things like at the discretion of your library director or director's designee in it. You generally don't want the board to be the ones making those day-to-day in the moment policy decisions. Because that's going to either require frequent special meetings or waiting until the monthly board meeting arrives. And when a policy issue comes up, things usually need to be acted on a lot faster than that. And I don't think you folks want to be called into a board meeting every week, every few days, even every couple of weeks to solve something that the director is well equipped to be able to handle. The director needs to have the power to make those decisions in the moment, or at least between the board meetings. And you'll need to have the confidence in your director and the policies that you set up, that they'll be carried out in the spirit in which the board has intended. It's also a good idea to have the director to be the first line of defense in the event somebody who complains about the policy doesn't like the outcome. So that creates sort of a chain of command, and you as a board can step in as a built-in appeals process and act as the final word. Um, if you are having the director make the day-to-day decisions about policy, this doesn't mean that the board is going to be kept in the dark. If a policy situation arises, especially in the event of something like a book challenge or something that could potentially make it into the media, the director should be given the board chair a heads up, and it should end up in the monthly director's report to the board. Um, Now, the library staff is going to be the director's eyes and ears. So the staff is going to be the people who are really on the front lines, having those not just day to day, but minute to minute patron interactions. They're going to let the director know what is and isn't working, circumstances that might be changing, patrons or situations that might have become or might be starting to become problematic. They're also going to be that initial front line enforcing the policies. So you need to keep in mind that your policies should be easy to read, explain, and most important of all, they should be easy to understand. As remember, the higher level library staff, especially the ones making the collection management decision, your library director, your assistant director, your youth services librarians, they are all professional level, highly trained librarians. The people who are on the front lines are going to vary in terms of their backgrounds and their level of experience with actual like academic library stuff. Um, so they may or may not have a lot of experience with policy in general. And even if they are, it's a lot to ask somebody who is regularly on the front lines of de-escalating a heated situation to then also go ahead and start to explain complex or difficult to understand policy, because that's just gonna bring that heat level right back up.
Al, before you move
So,
on to the next slide,
yes.
we have a question in the chat. I don't know if you'll address it later or you want to deal with it now. Question is, how does policy interact with employee handbook?
That is a very good question. So the employee handbook is going to be more dictated by the municipality in a lot of cases. The employee handbook is going to be what the hours, how you expect your, how the director usually expects the staff to arrive to work on time. If there is some kind of a dress code, any HR policies that the town or the city wants to include in there. The employee handbook is going to be getting the employees oriented to the actual working environment. The policy binder is going to affect everybody in the library, um, particularly patron and staff interactions. So the employee handbook is largely going to be dictated by the director and the municipality. The policy, those overarching governing rules, are going to be dictated by the board of trustees. And that's going to set the tone for the operational stuff. So policy is more big picture and how everybody comports themselves or how we handle loaning out these services, how we handle who is able to access our building, access our materials, and when and why and how. The employee handbook is going to be much more of an operational thing. Oh, all right. Thank you for bringing that up, Rod, because I have a very hard time switching back and forth between the two. So I appreciate the interruptions because I probably won't notice the chat popping up. All right. So, with the library director, the staff, and the trustees all sort of kind of talking to each other, this input makes the policy process very cyclical. So, you as a board are going to craft and authorize the policies with input from the library director, who in turn gets input from the library staff. The staff tell the library director when something isn't working. The director then reports to you as a board, and you review and revise the policy based on their recommendations to make sure that the library is functioning in a way that is safe and equitable for everybody who's inside the building. It can't happen in isolation. Otherwise, you're going to end up with policies that nobody bothers to follow, either because it's not practical for them to do so, which leaves them to the library to open for potential conflicts and lawsuits, which nobody, not even your municipality, wants. Um, or they don't follow them because they're too complicated and they don't understand them. And again, that does not do anything to protect you, your library, your staff, and even your municipality from conflicts and lawsuits. So, why does policy make such a difference when it comes to a library operating smoothly and safely when it isn't actually the operational parts of the library? Because policy is stability that is based on a foundation of action, accountability, consistency, and trust. You create stability with solid policy because you will have actionable steps to hold everyone involved accountable. You have a foundation built that people are far less likely to question when you create consistency by making sure that the policy applies to everyone and is easy to follow so that it can be acted on the same way with everyone. All of that taken together creates trust in the eyes of the community, which definitely comes in handy for getting use out of the library and getting funding for the library. When somebody can go to a shelf, pull out a document that clearly states what is and is not permitted in a particular situation, the only thing they actually have to know and hold in their head is where is that policy. They can read the policy, they can use that as a guideline to explain it to the person who may be having a situational issue in the library and just take it from there. It also means that there's going to be consistency among staff because very few things will invalidate a policy faster than it not passing strict scrutiny. I always cringe if I hear somebody say, well, so and so let me do this before. Why aren't you letting me do it now? Or I always get to do this when this person is around. That is a sign of a policy that is not fully working for your library and your situation. Either the staff need more training on what the policy is and why the policy is there and is important, or the policy needs clarification so that the staff can understand it better so that they can apply that policy to everybody equally. This can be anything from lending policies to, building access. Um, it's really helpful to keep patrons from getting confused. If everybody is acting consistently in the same way with everybody else, you don't want to have a patron standing behind somebody in line who got some sort of special treatment because somebody wasn't following the policy to come up and say, "Hey, why does that person get to do that? I never get to do that." And unless you have something in your policy that is a really good explanation of why that person got to do that, and it may have been an accommodation or something like that, there may be reasons, but you need to have that laid out. Um, because otherwise, you're going to get those high escalating tensions that is going to be really hard for the staff to bring back down. Um, so having solid policy makes a life a lot easier for any staff working on the front lines. Um, and you need to put the work in to create these foundations because if you are consistent and the policy applies to anyone equitably, there aren't special rules for special people, and you've got research and other library precedents backing you up, which is especially important if you're implementing new policies or at least new to your library policies, it's going to make it a lot harder to call the library, you, or your staff members arbitrary or biased. And that is extremely helpful if somebody tries to bring a lawsuit against you. One of the best pieces of policy advice I ever got was I was the assistant director of a library at the time, and my director and I had gone through our literally 20-year-old policy binder and taken some of the policies to the town council, and we're like, we just don't want to get sued. And the town council made a really good observation. She said, no, you don't want to get successfully sued. Anybody can sue you for anything. That's just the way our litigious society works. But a solid policy is going to keep you from getting successfully sued. And the ways to do that is to keep yourself from looking arbitrary, biased, or capricious by having solid, consistent policy. So let's take a few minutes to look at a few policies that are absolutely best practice to have in your policy binder and should be regularly updated. So, collection development policies. This is one policy that you are obligated to have in statute for Massachusetts libraries. So you thought you got away from the MGL from last week. You thought, yay, we did it. Nope. Now we've got Massachusetts General Law 78, so same section. I'm sorry, same chapter. This one is in section 33. So the Board of Trustees for a free public library in any city or town, or in the absence of such a board, the city or town official that has the powers to do so shall establish a written policy for the selection of library materials and the use of materials and facilities in accordance with the standards adopted by the American Library Association. No employee shall be dismissed for the selection of library materials when the selection is made in good faith and in accordance with the approved policy adopted pursuant to the provisions of this section, meaning section 33. That last part, that last sentence is a huge part of why this particular type of policy, the collection development policy, is essential. As long as any of the library's employees who have collection development responsibilities are following your policy, their jobs, and the professional standards that have been set out by the industry at large, their jobs are safe, regardless of whether an item they purchased gets challenged, regardless of the motivations for any of the challenges. Um, So your collection development policy or your CD policy should focus on how librarians are trained professionals. Emphasize how your staff researches your collection decisions using professional review sources. You should explain the process of weeding, what it is not, what guidelines you use to determine what books, items, materials go and what stay on the shelf. If your collection development practice focuses on inclusivity, representation, and making sure that your community has the windows, mirrors, and sliding doors that Dr. Rudine Sims Bishops describes, and I will make sure that you get the link to her wonderful, very brief talk in the resources that I send out with the recording and slides. That should be in your collection development policy. There should be an emphasis on professionalism throughout a collection development policy because not enough people realize just how much goes into being a librarian and how much training is involved. Professional standards, the ALA is mentioned in statute, but there are state library associations, and other professional guidelines that can also be included in the collection development policy. They don't necessarily have to be woven into the text. They can be included in full as appendices to your policy. And that's something that I actually like to or often prefer to do. The actual policy that people are reading and that a staff member would have to present or explain to a patron should be as brief as humanly possible. If you need to go in the details to make it more clear and understandable, that's fine. But if you are plunking the American Library Association's Bill of Rights for a reader in the middle of your text in a policy, that's going to be a lot to swallow. And so taking that text out and just saying, see Appendix A, and having the Appendix A right at the back of that policy makes the policy a lot easier to explain. And also, you've got the supplementing material right there for anyone who wants to look at it. Right at the top here is a request for reconsideration. This allows for civil discourse for good faith challenges. To my knowledge, you're under no obligation to keep this brief. If someone's coming to the library in good faith, they should be able to outline, in their own words, exactly why this item that they are challenging is not beneficial to your library's community and back up the assertion. If you lay out your expectations in this document clearly, so for example, it has to be filled out completely, no skipped questions. Answers cannot be plagiarized, so they can't be like copied and pasted off of social media. You have the right to reject the request for consideration or send it back to the requester, asking them to please fill it out according to the requirements that you have laid out in that document. A lot of people don't realize just how busy librarians are. And especially if you're new to being a library trustee, you will find out very quickly that libraries are generally understaffed. Um, they should not be doing the work to challenge the materials because they already did the work to research the titles and put them in the collection in the first place. It is incumbent upon the community member, as is their right as a community member, to explain in full detail, as laid out by the library, what their concern is and what they would like the library to do. Whoops, whoa. Had my mouse on the wrong spot there. Sorry about that. Um, One thing I will also mention, and Rob may have mentioned this briefly, but I do a periodic blog series called Fortifying Your Library that is on the MBLC's blog page, which you can get at from our homepage. Um, I have, I think, two posts that go over collection development policy and requests for reconsideration rather extensively. So if you want to do a little bit more of a deep dive on that, um, go ahead and check that out. And as always, you can always ask me with any questions. So,
I'll get that link in the chat too. But again, another question that might be helpful to posit here in the chat
yeah.
is the requirement for these requirements the same for association or 501(c)(3) libraries? What is the relationship with the statute?
So, and Rob, you can correct me on this. I believe this is tied to library certification, or is that for one of the bills that is coming up that they're
No,
still working on?
yeah, it is tied, but the bill that is actually no, the bill would tie this would tie a library materials challenge policy to certification. So you do need the collection development policy for certification. We have a bill out, it's in the House right now, the State House, and that would just add the reconsideration policy to be added
Ah,
to the
okay.
collection development. So it's kind of narrowing it, refining it a little bit.
Okay. So if you expect to be, if you would like to keep your library certified, which the biggest benefit to that is reciprocal borrowing through your network, even if you are an association library, this is a requirement that you should be following. And in a large part, I think it's also kind of tied to like if you are getting municipal funding, you are also at least partly a public library, and need to be following the statute on that. So this is not something that association libraries have an exception on. Um, so that's, yeah. So I would make sure that that's in your binder and up to date, just because challenges are more frequent now, and it's good to make sure that your policy is current to what the current situation is in your community. So another policy that I consider essential, it is not tied to statute. So this is definitely more of a best practice. Um, is generally what I refer to as patron rights and responsibilities policy. You may very well know it by a different name. Some people call it the patron behavior policy, the library use policy. Um, for some, it's a combination of policies. For others, they kind of break down parts of it out. But basically, whatever you call it, this is the policy that explains what you can permit in your library and what your facility and staff are not able to accommodate. The overarching idea here, and it's, I find this to be so important that I made this a subtitle on the slide. All people are welcome in the library. All behaviors are not. And this policy needs to hold everyone accountable for how they act in the library and keep the staff, the patrons, and the facility safe. So some of the things you want to consider when you are creating or revising a policy like this. Take a minute to envision how you use your library. What is the space used for? What does your community want from the space? What do they need the space most for? What is getting the most use? And where are the pain points that you're finding when it comes to usage in your library? Um, Does your policy allow for the responses to be applied equitably? So equitably doesn't necessarily mean the same. Equitable means with accommodations, can everybody use the library in the same way? Is everybody going to understand what these policies mean? Will they allow people to use all of the spaces and resources if they have accommodations or if they don't have accommodations? Um, you want to make sure that this part of your policy really makes sure that your library is welcoming to as many people as possible. Um, You also want to make sure that you have accountability for the staff and give them guidelines for treating people. So when I was drafting this policy, we had a section that said, patrons, while patrons are in the library, they must basic things, refrain from alcohol and all tobacco product use, including vaping on library property. But it also had a section of patrons can expect while they are in the library, prompt and courteous treatment from the staff. Um, and so you want to make sure that you don't turn this into an operational checklist. That's something for the library director to handle. But again, those broad, overarching concepts of like, you can expect to be treated fairly here. You can expect for us to respect your privacy at all times are things that can absolutely go in a policy. How you go about doing that is going to be different in a lot of cases for a lot of different libraries. So that's something that gets into the weeds of operations. But the fact that a library will always respect your privacy and that staff will not share your personal information, your reading tastes, etc., that can go in a policy because that is broad enough that it will be applicable to everyone. Accountability here also means that staff should know that it is okay to find assistance or call out a supervisor in order to de-escalate a tense situation and have solid guidelines on when they can ask somebody to extricate themselves from a situation. Um, if you have ever worked in any kind of customer service position ever, whether it's retail, libraries, anything customer facing, there are those tense moments. Um, and in libraries, when you've got all sorts of people coming together, and some people who are in some unfortunate situations that can put stress levels really, really high. Um, those situations can get incredibly tense, and staff needs to know that the policy has their back and that nobody's going to make them stand there and get yelled at for 10 minutes without having to, tap out and say, "Hey, manager over here, give us a little help," or to say, "You know what? Clearly, I am the person that is now upsetting this person. Let me step out here and get someone else to help you." Um, child safety, this can be a tricky one, and some people will have actually a separate child safety policy, which is completely valid and is going to be depending upon your community. Um, but definitely make sure that you have some format of a child safety policy where you define what an unsafe child is, when caregivers will be contacted, how staff should and should not act around unsupervised children. Um, it is not required, but I would recommend, especially having been a children's librarian for many years, putting somewhere in there that staff are not a substitute for childcare, and the public library is, in fact, a public space and should be treated as such when caregivers are considering leaving their children there unattended. This one especially, even if you are like, "We got this," for all of your other policies, have a lawyer look at the child safety policy just to be on the safe side. Um, and when you are thinking about all of the things that you want to make sure that your patrons are responsible for, your staff are responsible for, one thing that I recommend you don't do, or at least if you can't help it, not to let it get away from you too much, try not to catastrophize. Once you start imagining every scenario that can possibly go wrong in the library, you start making really specific policies that stray from the overarching purpose of keeping people safe and accountable. And instead, you start to create a very unwelcoming space with a laundry list of things that you are just plain not allowed to do, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a public library in the first place. Um, Also, for the sake of those people who are who may end up revising these policies 20 years later, if you are going to go that laundry list route, which I don't recommend, but please, I beg of you, annotate it. Because 20 years from now, when somebody sees a notation in their policy that says yo-yos are not allowed in the library, we are going to wonder what specific incident made somebody want to write that down and enshrine it in policy to keep yo-yos out, and we will never know. We were also going to want to know why it says that the elevator is only for use for transport between floors within the building. Again, I can I have a pretty good imagination and I can imagine many scenarios in which case this was necessary to tell people. But I want to know the final straw that made you want to put that into policy. And for those of us still not having the answers 20 years, well, now 20 plus years later, um, if you are going to start catastrophizing, at least tell us why. So a few other things that you might want to check for if you have these things, it's good practice to have them, but these are not necessarily going to be applicable to absolutely everybody. Um, Meeting room use policy. I have a rather, if you do have meeting rooms that are available for public use, I do have a rather extensive blog post or two in Fortifying Your Library that talks about meeting room use policies, if you would like to get into the weeds with that. Um, if you do programming, you might want to have a programming policy that's similar to your collection development policy, complete with a request for reconsideration. Um, some sort of crisis communication with scripts. This is especially useful for frontline staff so that they know what to say when somebody is infuriated and standing in front of them. So instead of getting that fight, flight, or freeze, instead of freezing, they just grab the script and read it to the person in front of them. Um, Things like circulation policies, internet use policies, those may actually be provided by your network. So they may have larger circulation policies or internet use policies if they're like hosting your servers and whatnot. So check with Noble, CW Mars, Sales, whichever network you use to see if they already have some of those policies in place. Social media policies are really, really tricky. They should kind of be considered similar to a meeting room in terms of it is basically a public forum. And once you start restricting things on there, the more you start restricting, the more trouble you can get yourself into. Public comment, I do want to draw your attention to this one because this is one that specifically affects the trustees. As a public body, and again, this applies far less to association libraries, but as a public body, you are not required to have a public comment period. But again, if you are trying to engender trust amongst your community, it might be something you want to consider having. Um, if you have a public comment period, you should have a public comment policy and make sure that you abide by that policy because that is going to keep the guardrails on your public comment period in your meetings and keep things from going haywire. And that I also have a Fortifying Your Library blog post about. Um, Donations and gifts. If you have generous community members and you either don't have a friends or foundation or sometimes people want to give directly to the library and they don't want to go through those specific channels. You'd probably want to have a donation and gift policy. Ideally, something that includes um, that once something has been given to the library, especially if we're talking about physical materials, um, that the library has the right to do with it what they choose. And it is not like donor's choice, because everybody thinks that their, you know, stack of 50-year-old paperbacks, but it's a complete set of whatever is really essential for the library to have. The librarians may have other opinions based on professional collection development resources. And sometimes that box of moldy books that was left on your front doorstep was left with the best of intentions, but cannot be circulated because of the condition of the books. So you want to make sure you're a little bit protected there so that people are not expecting whatever they give to the library to end up on the shelf out of the gate. These will apply to some libraries, not to others. So just keep an eye out if you have a makerspace, if your library does home delivery, if you offer museum passes, even if they are funded by the library friends or a foundation, if you are still circulating them through the library and have certain rules about them, you probably want to have a policy related to that. If you have a dedicated teen space or a dedicated children's space, you may want to have a policy about um, who can hang out there and when. If you have, I know, especially here in Massachusetts, libraries are, the buildings are historical in many cases. They often have historical archives or artifacts. So consider having a policy that applies to those as well. So, some best practices overall, regardless of the policy that you happen to be editing at the time. Focus on what you can allow, because this is why we write policy. We're not trying to be punitive. We're not trying to tell people what we can do. We are trying to allow the people who make the library a place where all community members can feel comfortable, free to express their ideas, free to use a space that asks for nothing but basic accountability in return, to use the knowledge, the skills, and the ability that they bring to their jobs every day. And the policy is going to give them the space to do those jobs well. Um, Use plain language. If nobody can understand the policies, they're not going to do anything to keep anybody safe. Keep them readily available. Everyone on the board should have a copy of the policy binder. Um, and I'll reiterate making it sure that you get input from your director. Um, Often the directors will actually write the policies for you and just get feedback from the board. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a heavy lift for you. Um, and because they're dealing with the public so often, they're often good at getting that into that plain language. Um, Make sure, above all, that your policy is legally defensible. If at all possible, consult a lawyer. If your municipality pushes back about using town council because they're worried about the money, remind them that any kind of lawsuit is going to be vastly more expensive. And for don'ts, don't reinvent the wheel. Use the resources you have at hand. Your orientation packet that you'll be getting at after the fourth session with the resources will have a link to Mass Library System's policy collection. Also take a look at libraries that are similar to yours in size, municipal governments, and what I call like aspirational libraries. When we were doing our library policy binder, my director and I were looking at some libraries and being like, that's the library we want ours to be when it grows up. And so we were looking at those policies and what they did to see how much of that we could emulate. Never assume that the law works for you. Libraries may not be neutral, but the laws sure as heck are. And this is where being consistent with your policies is critical. If you don't apply policies consistently, if you're only writing them with the intention of benefiting only certain groups, your policy is not going to hold up. And that's leaving your board, your institution, your municipality, possibly you as an individual, vulnerable to ramifications that include but are definitely not limited to lawsuits. Um, and most importantly, do not let your policies sit on a shelf forgotten. They need to be living documents. Make sure that all of the work that you have put into them doesn't end up as an amusing anecdote from somebody giving a presentation 20 years later. Check them, revise them. Situations change. The policy should change with them. And if at all possible, put them on a review schedule for every couple of years. So it's not an overwhelming project to redo the entire binder. And your future board members, your future selves, and your future library administration will be extremely grateful to you for that. Um, so once the pieces are in place, work with your director on the implementation and the distribution of the policies. And once you're pretty happy with what you've got, that's a good time to set about the review schedule. So ask yourself, how often do we need to look at this? For the big essential policies like patron rights and responsibilities, collection development, I recommend looking at them every 2 to 3 years. Some of them you may be able to go longer for those. Um, Check through your policy binder every once in a while and see, is anything missing? Is there a policy? Is there something going on with the library that maybe a policy would help smooth over? Ask your director and make sure the director asks the staff, what's working with the policy? What's not working? And those are questions that when it comes up for review, you'll have at the ready and you'll sort of have a template to work off of because you kind of already know what's working, what isn't. Okay, here's what we need to focus on for this. And just keeping it as regular as humanly possible is going to be your best friend for this because that's going to be what keeps it from being hugely overwhelming. So again, your homework assignment, find your policy binder, take a look at it, and if at all possible, see if you can set up even a tentative review schedule that you might be able to bring to the board, or see if your board actually has one already, in which case, kudos, great job. Um, so with that, thank you for bearing with me. And while I get my nerd on and enjoy talking about policy, Rob and I are here for any other questions that you folks might have. Thank you for your great questions so far. Let's see. Let me actually bring up. Oh, there we go. Let me stop sharing so I can at least bring up get the Brady Bunch back. And that way, at least if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. Drop it in the chat.
Everybody's eager to crack open those binders.
Yeah. Oh, yes, Diana. Yeah, I think I probably bunkered down in my office for about 6 months when I was revising my policy binder. It was 2023, and I am not kidding. There were policies that were last revised in November of 2003. So that was, yes. And yes, the yo-yos and the elevator are burned into my brain, especially because I will never get the answers.
I can only chime in on the yo-yos that when I was in the seventh grade, they were banned from the the middle school for danger in the playground. We had
Oh, well, those were the peak days for Duncan. So
yeah, we had a guy come in and do a little yo-yo show, and then everyone in the school bought a yo-yo, and then chaos ensued.
bet you they never brought that guy back.
Never got him back.
Um, oh, how often should policies be reviewed and updated? It depends on the policy, but like the big ones, the collection development and stuff, if you can tackle those every 2 years, get them on a rotation for that. And it doesn't have to be the same year, maybe every 2 or 3. I would definitely recommend doing that just to make sure that those are the ones that are most affected by the changing circumstances in your community. And I, I, I think we're all finding that the world at large is changing at a pace that is incredibly rapid and difficult for a lot of us to keep up with. So the best you can do to keep your policies in line with that changing landscape as well, at least within your individual community, the better. For some of the bigger ones, for some of the, I guess maybe not smaller ones, but less detailed or less crisis-based ones, you might want to put those on like every 5 years or something. Sort of do that for a rotation. And you don't have to necessarily say, okay, we're dedicating this one meeting to, these 5 policies. You can bring it up, all right, let's do this, this year we've got 4 policies to look at. So let's bring up one every 2 months, and get through the policy binder that way. So that way you're not doing them in large chunks and you're kind of not getting policy fatigue because it feels like your eyes are going cross looking at these things for so long.
Yeah, I'd also keep an eye out what's happening in the library community. The past couple of years, we've had a couple very newsworthy occurrences where policies around what a art gallery, how they acquire, how they do their exhibits, who okays that. Also, Al had mentioned the public room use, where, if you have a policy that says anyone can book the room, that means anyone. And so it could be either side of whatever belief system that may contradict what you think. The other part of that is also, little things like if it's an outside booking, do you then put that on your library calendar to promote it, or do you not? If, and be clear about that, because an outside group may expect that, well, I booked the room, so you're going to do a little promotion for me. So little nuances like that. And if you just see, keep an eye on one of the things is I would encourage folks to sign up for the trustee discussion list, but see what's going on in other libraries. And they may be going through something that A, alerts you to, we need a policy on this, and B, if that's either a great way to do it or they did it the wrong way, we don't want to go down that road. So always be aware of what's going on in the community as well.
Yeah. And you also want to make sure that your policies are as accessible as possible to anyone. And that means obviously paper copies in the library. When I was a library administrator, I liked to have like copies of like the hot button, the meeting room policy, the collection development policy, the patron rights and responsibility policy. I had extra copies printed out at every service point, just so in the middle of a tense situation, patrons are like, "What do you mean I can't do that? Why can't I do that?" Somebody could just grab the policy, show it to them, and say, "Here, this is yours to keep and review at your leisure." So it didn't have to say, like, "Here, this is the policy, this is where it says it," and then they either walk away with the entire policy binder or come back. But also, it's really helpful to have your policies online if you don't already. Have them on your library's website, their own little subsection on the website. And most libraries already do this, so your library probably already is too. But this is actually a great way to find out what other libraries in your general area are doing in terms of their policies. So again, you're not having to reinvent the wheel. If you take a look and say, huh, every other library within like a 20-mile radius has this policy. Why don't we? And it may genuinely be because you don't need that, but at least you've brought it up as a point of discussion and considered why you do or do not need that particular policy. And if you do, you can print out those neighboring library policies and use that to kind of Frankenstein your own policy together. And you don't have to go writing it from scratch. So, this is, it doesn't have to be as heavy a lift as it sounds. And that's one thing libraries and librarians love to do is share. So never worry about, popping into somebody else's policy and going, "Ooh, I think I'll use that. I like the way they phrase that. Let me use that." Go for it.
Years ago, I did have at an orientation, a trustee asked what the copyright was on policies, and we're like, copyright in the library policy world, don't be foolish. We love to share and build on each other's. And one place I would recommend also, because they just have so many odd policies, Boston Public Library. I mean, they have a policy about everything. They even have. I remember someone had a question about what do you allow them to film in the library, and they have a very expensive, because of the historic buildings, very extensive. How do you set up what's allowable, and you can take from that, and it's very helpful. But I always check around, and see what other folks are doing. All right.
All right. Well, we're just past the hour, so I am perfectly willing to give all of you the rest of your nights back. Thank you so much for your attention and your great questions. My second favorite topic to talk about with trustees is advocacy, so that's coming